India's history of spaceflight actually dates back to the 1970s, and they are one of the very few independent nations or entities to have developed and flown a series of orbital rockets. There was a period in the late 90s and early 2000s when India was the go-to provider of cheap satellite launches. India has even reached the moon and Mars with their spacecraft. Now, things haven't always gone to plan with India's outer space ambitions, their most recent SSLV rocket test failure only being the latest in a series of misses. By 1992, this had allowed the country to increase their payloads to orbit by deploying a 106-kilogram satellite. By 1993, India had applied 2 decades of research and development to create the iconic Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, or PSLV. This was a massive improvement over the first designs and brought some legitimate muscle to the Indian space program. This was another 4-stage rocket that again used a solid fuel core booster, now with a maximum of 6 strap-on side boosters for the XL configuration. The second stage utilized India's first liquid-fueled engine, the Vikas, which was essentially just a copy of Europe's Viking engine, but it worked, so no shade. Then they went back to a solid rocket third stage, and again to a liquid-fueled fourth stage. This upped the launch capacity to just under 4 metric tons to low Earth orbit, and just under 2 tons to polar orbit. This rocket became an international staple for providing the cheapest access to outer space, and it would go on to complete 53 launches through the late 90s and early 2000s. India never swayed from their philosophy of efficient and frugal spaceflight. Somehow, India managed to develop and build a serviceable orbital rocket with just a tiny fraction of the funding that other nations were throwing into spaceflight. India would spend in a year what NASA would spend in a month, and that allowed them to offer flights on the PSLV at a heavily discounted rate. The cost to launch 1 kilogram of weight into space on the PSLV was about $8,500, while the cost to fly 1 kilogram on the space shuttle was about $18,000. Now, eventually SpaceX would rise up and dominate the low-cost orbital launch market with their reusable Falcon 9 booster, which eventually drove the cost per kilo of an orbital launch down to just $2,600. But India continued on with their mission unfazed. A legitimate, controlled touchdown on the moon with their Vikram lander that would go on to study and map the lunar surface. The mission launched on the GSLV Mark III rocket in July 2019. A month later, it had reached orbit around the moon. The Vikram lander was deployed according to plan, and everything seemed to be going great until about halfway to the surface, when something went terribly wrong with the vehicle, and it seemed to flip upside down at one point, with the thruster driving it towards the moon's surface instead of slowing it down. Vikram impacted the moon at a speed of about 100 meters per second and scattered little bits of debris over several kilometers of lunar surface. So that was a bit of a low point, but they carried on. India's latest rocket development is the SSLV, or Small Satellite Launch Vehicle, which is basically a modern take on the same mission as the old PSLV, cheap and efficient service to low Earth orbit. Satellites have gotten a lot smaller over the last couple of decades, so the need for a higher capacity rocket has fallen off. Accordingly, the SSLV is designed for a maximum of 500 kilograms to low Earth orbit. This is where smaller rocket startups like Firefly and Rocket Lab have been able to capitalize in recent years with cheap and lightweight small sat launchers. So India are looking to get in on the action. Unfortunately, the first launch attempt of the SSLV didn't go as planned, and the payload didn't reach orbit. Though it wasn't a total failure. The 4-stage rocket completed 3 successful burns. It was only the final module that experienced a software glitch and failed to fire its thrusters for more than 0.1 of a second in what should have been a 20-second burn. India has some really ambitious plans for their future of spaceflight, including another shot at the moon, a human spaceflight, and an interplanetary trip to Venus. The Chandrayaan-3 mission is slated to launch next year in 2023 and is essentially a second attempt at what was supposed to happen on the Chandrayaan-2, with a lander and a rover on the lunar surface. Then the plan is to follow that up in 2024 with India's first human spaceflight mission named Gaganyaan. This was aspirationally supposed to happen in 2020, but there were obvious delays. And in the meantime, the Indian Space Agency has decided to slow down and make sure that everything is as safe as possible. The idea is to use the GSLV Mark III rocket with the Gaganyaan crew capsule that is designed to carry 3 people into space. The mission plan is to have the 3 crew spend a total of 7 days in orbit to fully test the capabilities of the new module. These would be the first ever Indian Vyomanauts in space,